Dr. Uma Ramachandran, Doctorate in Ecology and Environmental Sciences. She has 22 years of diverse work experience that include technical assistance and coordination of various projects related to environment and biodiversity conservation, natural resource management, environmental impact assessment, socio-economic studies and poverty reduction. She is engaged with German International Cooperation Climate Change Project at the Department of Environment, Government of Tamil Nadu. She has served as ENVIS Coordinator at Environment Protection Training Research Institute, Senior Scientist at MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, in addition to being faculty for PG course on Preventive Environment Management, University of Hyderabad, and guest faculty at Anna University, Chennai. She is trained in various field-oriented techniques. She has been a resource person in several training programs. She has published many articles in national and international journals, newsletters, edited books and proceedings.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series on environmental sciences. This is continuation on the section on biodiversity concepts and conservation. So today we are going to look at the ecological succession and the different types of succession, what are the threats to succession, and ways and means of measuring biodiversity. So now, what is ecological succession? The observed process of change in the species structure of an ecological community over time. See, I have already mentioned to you in the earlier series about the ecosystem, that every ecosystem and every natural community has a specific structure, role, function, and also specific species components you find in them. So lot of changes occur in a community. So the observed process of change in the species structure of an ecological community over time is actually termed as your ecological succession. The community begins with relatively few pioneering plants and animals and develops through increasing complexity until it becomes stable or self-perpetuating as a climax community. See, what exactly it means is that pioneering community are those which colonizes an area first. So these pioneering species of plants and animals come into being initially, and then it grows into a stable community. Succession occurs in all natural environments. So each environment has a particular name that expresses the nature of their ecological succession. Okay, so you have actually there is a different types of succession that is existing. So one is the primary succession and then the secondary succession. Here this picture shows the diagram of ecological succession. What happens in from year 1 to 100 plus years. So here in the first year you find some small horseweed dominant, then crabgrass and pigweed which actually colonize. So these are the pioneering colonizers in this region. In the second year you find asters become dominant and there is some crabgrass left. Then between the 3rd to 18th year you find that it becomes a grass scrub community. Then you have broom sedge grass, pines are just coming in during this stage, and between the 19th to 30th year you find young pine forest. In the 30th to 70th year you find a mature pine forest, and under the mature pine forest you find understory of young hardwoods. Then we move on to the 70th to 100th year. Here you find that you have pine to hardwood transition. So from the pine it is there is a transition to the hardwoods, and in the 100th year and plus 100 plus years you find the climax oak hickory forest. So you can imagine how long it takes for the succession to happen, from the pioneering stage up to the climax community. So in the succession the pioneering community are first getting into the area, and then you find the stable climax community. Now we go to what is the primary succession and secondary succession. So, primary succession is the process of creating life in an area where no life previously existed. So, the development of an ecosystem in an area that has never had a community living with it occurs by a process called primary succession, in other words. So, an example of an area in which a community has never lived before would be a new lava or rock from a volcano that makes a new island. So, these rocks, first you find the crustacean species, those which colonize the rocky area are called the crustacean species. So, it can start off with, for instance, a lichen, and then you can find herbs, mosses, pteridophytes, higher levels of plants like shrubs and trees, and finally you get into the climax community. So, this is a typical primary succession that is happening. Next we go to the secondary succession, before which we can just have a look at this diagram. You have the bare rocks, for instance, lichens are just colonizing this region, and you have the mosses, herbs and weeds. So, this entire stretch, this green bar shows you the pioneer stages. Next, the intermediate stages, you find the grasses, the shrubs, the pines and immature oaks. So, this becomes your intermediate stages. So, hundreds of years later, finally you end up in this climax community, which is shown in this picture. So, this is a typical primary succession. Now, what is secondary succession? This is the process of restabilization that follows a disturbance in an area where life has formed an ecosystem. So, here what exactly happens is you have a natural system in place, but due to disturbances, it may be either natural or it may be man-made disturbances. So, these disturbances will create lot of changes in the existing area or a community. So, after these some of the species get wiped off, it tries to kind of come back to the original state, but of course it takes a long period of time, but then it will be much lesser than the primary succession, the time period. So, here the secondary succession begins in habitats where communities were entirely or partially destroyed by some kind of a damaging event. So, here is a picture, on top you find the trees and there is some area that is cleared. So, this is due to some disturbance that is happening. So, in the picture below you find that some disturbances have occurred. So, in the disturbed area you first find these grasses, then the shrubs and then small trees, and then it comes back to the climax forest species will come back to the area. So, when an existing community has been cleared by a disturbance such as fire, tornado, etc., and the soil remains intact, the area begins to return to its natural community. Because these habitats previously supported life, secondary succession, unlike primary succession, begins on substrates that already bear soil. In addition, the soil contains a native seed bank. So, this is the difference between your primary and secondary succession. Since the soil is already in place, secondary succession can take place 5 to 10 times faster than the primary succession. This basically shows the difference between the primary and the secondary succession. And now we look at why actually the succession process happens in the original environments. This is because it is the process of life for plants, soil and other living organisms. And it is because organisms alter soil structure, chemistry and microclimates, the species composition of ecological communities constantly changes over time. Succession will continue until the environment reaches its final stage, which is the climax community. So, here there are some pictures of different ecosystem types shown, and the climax community, coming to the climax community, you define climax community as a mature, stable community that is the final stage of the ecological succession. In an ecosystem with a climax community, the conditions continue to be suitable for all the members of the community. Any particular region has its own set of climax species, which are the plants that are best adapted for the area, persist after succession has finished until another disturbance clears the area. So, essentially when you look at the climax community, it is stable in all aspects, but this same climax community actually differs between areas. In a particular ecosystem, there will be a certain set of climax community. In a different, in ecosystem A, it will be different. In ecosystem B, again you have a separate set of climax community. So, this actually varies, but all said and done, the succession process occurs in all these communities, and mostly it will be secondary succession, and rarely we also find the primary succession happening starting from the initial stage, but mostly you find that most of the areas here are disturbed and in fact has been cleared beyond repair. So, people are trying to reintroduce species today to these regions. Now, two main physical factors that determine nature of the community that develops in an area, these are basically temperature and the amount of rainfall or precipitation. If we place the amount of rainfall on graphs x axis from say 0 to 10, 10 to 20 and 20 to 30 plus inches, and temperature along the y axis from hot, moderate to cold, you find various types of ecosystems which will fit into the graph based on the conditions that they require. So, here you find the stable, the temperature is on top and rainfall in inches down below. So, in a cold temperature with a rainfall of 0 to 10 inches, you find a cold desert. Moderate temperature, you find temperate forest. Hot temperature, you find hot deserts. And when you look at, for instance, the rainfall inches 20 to 30 plus inches, with a cold temperature you find the taiga forests, and in the moderate temperature you find deciduous forest, and hot temperature you find tropical forests. So, this two factors actually contribute a lot for the type of community you find in these different regions. The grasses that move in as pioneer species are often thought of as weeds. So, the subsequent growth of shrubs are actually considered undesirable brush. So, without these intermediate stages, the disturbed habitat can't return to a natural forest. See, essentially it means that if these are not considered as the pioneering species, for instance, people will just clear the grass continuously, or maybe the shrub, but the thing is, these are the most important elements for the climax community to come back in this region. So, therefore, it is very important that we keep all these elements intact in the region. Then the fragility and stability of the ecological community are dependent upon several factors. For example, in temperate forests, if the shrubs are not allowed to grow, insect pests begin to feed on young trees instead. So, this has happened in many places where trees are replanted after an area is clear cut. So, large quantities of pesticides are then brought in, polluting the soil and water and also altering the natural ecosystem even further. Essentially, we find the communities, the fragile ecosystems are very much vulnerable to the lot of disturbances that occur, both natural and man-made. We will take a small break and come back and continue. Welcome back to the lecture series, UGC lecture series on environmental sciences. Before the break, we were looking at ecological succession and the different types of succession. Now we move on to the portion on measuring biodiversity. Like we had earlier lecture series, we have been looking at the different kinds of diversity, that is genetic diversity, where diversity in genes actually speaks about the different organisms, then the species diversity, then we also looked at ecosystem diversity. So, now we are looking at measuring genetic diversity. Molecular techniques are one of the ways of measuring genetic diversity. So, until recently it was mostly done on domesticated species and populations in zoos and botanic gardens. Increasingly the techniques are now being used on wild species too. So, there are some examples. For instance, northern elephant seals hunted almost to extinction in the 1890s were 20 individuals to 30,000 individuals with very little genetic diversity. The other example is Ireland's dependence on a limited genetic resource of just one variety of potato undermined actually the country's food supply. So, therefore, genetic traits that make the individuals more likely to survive and reproduce will become increasingly common in a population. In the earlier lecture, we looked at what is meant by a population. All the individuals that belong to one single species is called a population. So, genetic traits that make individuals more likely to survive and reproduce will become increasingly common in a population, and genetic traits that decrease the individual's chances of reproducing will become less common in the population. So, all those that have the desired genes will actually reproduce better, and the other species which do not have the specific requirement of the genes, then it will slowly get wiped off. Therefore, a species will evolve over time. So, it is dependent on fitness, and the other parameter is the mutation. So, fitness is measure of reproductive success, the relative contribution of an individual to the gene pool of the next generation. Whereas mutation is something that happens suddenly, and the process by which a gene or some other DNA sequence undergoes a change in the structure. So, if a mutation occurs which increases an organism's fitness, it may lead to creation of new species via natural selection. Species. So, what is a species? It is a group of organisms that inbreed and produce fertile offspring. So, we are looking at species diversity. How many species are there? I mean, we know that about 1.75 million have been described, and many more exist, that is greater than 5 to 10 million or more. So, what is the origin of species diversity? Natural selection, the evolutionary process whereby the bearers of some genes reproduce more successfully than the bearers of other genes within the existing biotic community. Whereas speciation is the formation of new species via natural selection and or isolation. So, we will have a detailed look at what exactly it means. Natural selection versus speciation isolation. 5 main propositions for the theory of evolution by natural selection. So, number 1 is individuals within a population are not identical, that is there is variation, this we know. Then number 2 is some of this variation is heritable, that means it is inherited. And number 3, all populations have the potential to populate the whole earth, but they do not, because some individuals die before reproducing and most reproduce at a less than maximal rate. Point number 4 is different individuals leave different numbers of offsprings. Like if you look at any species, the amount of offsprings produced by an elephant is completely different from an amount of offsprings produced by a mouse. So, this is a complete difference. Then the number of offspring produced depends on the interaction between the characteristics of the individual and the environment. So, now we go back to speciation isolation. Now, you have two. Number 1 is allopatric speciation, that is geographical isolation or physical barriers actually prevent the gene flow in this case. For example, snapping shrimp populations separated by Isthmus of Panama 3 million years ago, freshwater seals in Finland. So, these are some examples. And sympatric speciation is ecological or behavior isolation, for example doubling of the chromosome number in plants, or it may be timing of the spawning in sea urchins. So, over time genetic variability between two populations is so great that they can no longer interbreed. it reaches a stage where it becomes a completely new species. So, formation of a new species is what is called as the speciation. Does natural selection lead to perfection? No, since no population can contain all the possible genetic variants that might exist and influence the fitness. The next question that arises is, does natural selection lead to perfection? Natural selection favors those that are most fit from among all that are available. So, there are lots of genes available. The nature actually picks and selects the most fittest populations. So, example of natural selection, in this picture you find the peppered moth. This example of peppered moth in the 19th century England. So, this moth actually was in the industrial areas when industries were just beginning. So, these had a very pale colored wings, but due to a lot of industrialization, lot of the industrial soot started getting on the barks of the trees. So, they were very much conspicuously visible for the insectivorous birds that used to eat these moths. So, over a period of time, these moths developed dark colored wings. So, this became inconspicuous for all these insectivorous birds, and this was completely a different kind of a species when compared to the other moths of the same species. So, this picture actually shows you the difference. In the first picture it was not visible at all, but in the next case you find that this light pale winged moth is so conspicuously visible, whereas the newly developed species, how it has over a period of time it has developed this dark colored wings. Specific genes that is pertaining to the character of the color of wings have been changed. Now, we go to the island biogeography theory, where we look at what happens between the mainland and the islands. In this picture you find a piece of mainland, and then you have island A, island B. These two are situated at different distances from the mainland. So, the theory actually suggests here that the larger the island, the more species it will have. And the second theory is, the closer the island to the mainland, the more species it will have. So, important implications for protected areas, as they are often ecological islands. So, today we are talking of a lot of natural, the protected areas, sacred groves and so on. So, these become actually specific ecological islands. Now, this picture shows finches, 13 species of finches. So, islands are particularly interesting for studying evolution. For example, you find 13 species of finches on the Galapagos Islands that arose from one single species over a few million years. So, this is number one, is the first species. From that we find that so many have been arising from this one single species over a period of time. Now, this is one more picture which is showing you the evolution of dietary adaptations in the beaks of Hawaiian honey creepers. So, number one right below in the picture, this is actually the unknown finch-like colonist from the North America, but you find how it has diversified into several other species. You find that the shape of the beak has changed, and according to the diet, how the beaks have completely changed, and you find newly looking species. If you look at the first to the left, you find all those birds that eat fruits and seeds, which feed on fruits and seeds. Then right on top, 6 and 7, you find those that feed on insects and no nectar. Then in the middle you find species that feed on insects and some nectar. Then 9 and 13 and 14, these feed on nectar and some insects. And finally you find 17 here, which feeds only on fruit. In fact, 9, 13, 14, 15, 16, all these feed on nectar and some insects. So, this is the kind of evolution according to the dietary adaptation that has happened in these honey creepers. So, to summarize, we find that ecological succession is a dynamic process occurring in a given community. Many threats exist to succession process, and measures to stop these threats is required to keep the natural systems intact. The other important point is that it is important to measure biodiversity with all the genetic species and ecosystem diversity, as this reflects the changes that are occurring over a period of time in a given community. There are some questions related to this section that we have just looked at. So, question number 1 is, what is ecological succession and what are the types of succession? What are the threats to succession process? In what way will measuring biodiversity help? And how do you measure genetic diversity and species diversity? So, with this we come to the end of this section on ecological succession and measuring species and genetic diversity. So, we will continue with the other sections in the next lecture series. Thank you.